Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the All Things Policy podcast. I am your host for today, Arindam Goswami. I work as a research analyst at the Takshashila Institution. And I have with me today my colleagues Ashwin and Hitesh. Hey, hi Ashwin. Hi Hitesh. Welcome.
Hi Arindam. Yeah. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so today the topic we've chosen for this episode is around navigation satellites, specifically the NavIC system that India has built, the navigation with Indian Constellation system. Navigation satellites are sort of invisible infrastructure until they aren't, right? In an era where GPS signals are being jammed over conflict zones, spoofed to sink ships, and also being denied to adversaries in wartime, controlling your own navigation system does become a marker of true strategic sovereignty. India built NavIC for probably exactly this reason. But today the system has some problems, which we'll discuss in this episode. It's been crippled by some atomic clock failures, delayed launches, and some sort of neglect. In this episode, we examine what NavIC's crisis reveals about India's priorities, what it costs the military, and we would also look at what it would actually take to fix it. So yeah, let's jump right into it. Most people think of GPS or a navigation system as a convenience, right? Something that helps them find a restaurant. But counterintuitively, navigation satellites are arguably one of the most powerful geopolitical tools that a country can possess, right? So it would be great if you guys can just explain why a country losing access to someone else's navigation system is actually a cause for building one's own strategic program. And have there been instances when this has been illustrated for India in quite a brutal possible way?
Sure, Arindam. So I think in order to understand this, probably it will be a bit useful if we can go into a little bit of history. So Sputnik, which was launched in 1957, so that was the starting point when the Americans, they were not only jolted to the entire space race and the fact that Russia had stealed a one-up in the space race march over them, but also at the same time, some of the researchers in US, they sort of, when they were trying to track Sputnik, they realized that when the satellite was approaching them, the signals which were they were able to track, they were getting bunched up. So it was like a Doppler effect of a train which is approaching you, and the whistle keeps getting shriller and shriller. And when it was leaving them, then the signals were getting spaced farther and farther apart. Again, the analogy of a train. So based on this sort of an experience, it was in fact during 1957-58, even before the Americans went into the space race or they launched aircraft towards the moon, there was already research on in terms of people trying to figure out, hey, if we are able to sit on the ground and track a satellite in the sky, can we also not do the reverse of it? So that was sort of the genesis of the global positioning system. And thereafter, they, of course, they conceptualized this in 1970s. Early 1970s was when they got the congressional approvals. And then by around the early to mid 1980s, they had a functioning GPS, that is the Navstar Global Positioning System, which was working fairly well. And by its very word, the term GPS, global positioning, it implies that it is a constellation of satellites which are in the MEO orbit, that is at around 20,000 kilometers from the surface of the Earth. And in theory, we require about 24 satellites, which are at some angle and are rotating once around the Earth at a period of 12 hours. So if you are at a single position on the Earth, you will be able to see that single satellite over you twice in a day. So this was how the GPS infrastructure was built. Now coming to your question about how this global positioning system quickly became a tool of geopolitical influence. In our Indian context, what happened is during, now we fought the Kargil war during 1999. And as we all know, I just said that 1982 was, in fact, that was a time when we already had a functioning global positioning system. So during that time, we experienced something known as a selective availability, which means that the GPS signal was either degraded or totally not available. It was jammed in certain areas of the country, or this GPS signal which was available to us, it was in any case not the precise GPS signal which is available to the US military. So the Indian forces, they could not carry out the usage of GPS in their sort of operations during Kargil. And this led to the Indian government to realize that, listen, we also need to have our own navigation system, and that was the genesis of NavIC. Now, this discussion which started in 99, in fact, what happened is in 2000, in the year 2000, US actually removed this selective availability of GPS and it made it available to the entire world. But the experience of Kargil was still fresh with us, and we said that we will never be in future dependent on someone else's positioning system for something which is as vital as finding our direction. And hence, in 2013, we launched the first satellite of NavIC.
Right. Could you maybe throw some light on how this NavIC system is designed? What's its architecture? So apparently, it uses geostationary and geosynchronous satellites rather than the medium Earth orbit that GPS uses. So, I mean, is that an interesting technical choice, or does it give us some benefits, or the reverse? So, could you just walk us through that design logic?
Sure. So the architecture of NavIC is very much in proportion to the aspirations that India as a nation has or had at that point of time. Now, for our needs, we felt that a system of navigation which enables us to function within the Indian subcontinent region and an area which is some 1500 kilometers on the east and west, north and south of the country, that should be sufficient for our needs of both civilian use as well as limited military use. So, in that regards, instead of having a system of satellites which is located all throughout the globe, we decided that, all right, let us have a system of satellites which are constantly overhead our country. And we launched NavIC in a different orbit. That orbit is known as the G orbit, which is at 36,000 kilometers approximately. So the advantage that this offered was that we need not invest in a larger infrastructure of supporting a worldwide system of satellites, which not only requires an extensive space-based system of satellites, but also an extensive ground-based system where you require different sort of master control stations or located all throughout the earth for enabling this space-based system to function. And probably Ashwin might be able to jump in here.
Yeah. So with every one of these navigation systems, or as they are called, navigation satellite systems, they can be regional or global. The familiar names in the navigation satellite systems, like the GPS or GLONASS or Galileo, which is the American, the Russian, and the European navigation satellite systems, are all global systems. So they have more satellites, and like Hitesh said, they are all over the world and they have a global coverage. But India wants to start off as a regional navigation satellite system, which will cover only Indian subcontinent and 1,500 kilometers beyond its borders. We do have plans to eventually scale this up to a global coverage, but right now the priority was to start with a regional coverage, and that is what we have done. And there are some architectural choices that have been made to optimize for time, cost, and efficiency. So again, like Hitesh mentioned, many of the Indian satellites, all the Indian satellites, are in something that we call the geosynchronous orbits, which are around 36,000 kilometers from the Earth's surface. In contrast to the other global navigation satellite systems, or GNSS systems, which are all in the middle Earth orbit, which is somewhere between 36,000 and 1,000 kilometers. It's a big window, but most of them are around 20,000, 22,000, 24,000. It's in that range of altitude, and so they are much closer at the end of the day. But this functions like you're holding up a torch with a light beam that keeps spreading outwards. The farther you go, the more the light will spread, right? So it's kind of similar with this as well. So the higher up you are, the more coverage you get from a single satellite. So as a result, we are able to do a regional coverage with fewer number of satellites, and that's the contrast that is immediately visible. The NavIC satellite system has a designed constellation of 7 satellites, but you contrast this with GPS, which has over 30. GLONASS has 24, by though the Chinese one has over 40. So you see that the design and the way it has been conceived is pretty different.
Right. But considering today's geopolitical conditions, would it also be prudent to have a global sort of a system? I mean, the ones along the lines of these other 5 major navigation systems that you just mentioned, right? Does it make sense to also aim for that?
See, with the way the Iran war is shaping up, and you see that the missile use in wars has become predominant, and you see long range missiles being used. The range of the war has increased a lot, and so therefore, does it help to have a greater coverage for your own military use case? Definitely. But I think the priority is still India and Indian subcontinent for our country, because those are all edge cases. I think, like, just going by what 80% of the times we just need this, and we need this a lot. The rest is good to have, and we can scale it up. We do have plans of scaling it up to around 24 satellites in the distant future. But I think it is perfectly fine that we are currently a regional navigation satellite system. But Hitesh might have more thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I totally agree with what Ashwin has just said. And having said that, the positioning services are, in a sense, very globally available. And that is true for a reason. See, why the US actually removed the selective availability in the year 2000, they did that not because of, out of some sense of altruism, they did that because of a practical requirement. Now, we already have system which is global, not on a case-to-case basis, but on a 24/7 basis, which is global aviation. So a country like the US, it has flights moving in and out of continental United States and going to all the places in the world 365 days of the year. And the same is true of the other nations. So it was a practical requirement which led the USA to feel that we need to make this system available all throughout the world, if for nothing else, then just for our own aircraft to navigate successfully from place A to place B, and also to use the system after having arrived at place B to land successfully at the place B. So it was around in the mid 1990s when they had started this debate, and they had sort of come to the consensus that we should open up the GPS signals to the entire world. We should remove selective availability. And by the time they ended up doing that, that was the year 2000. So now the GPS is available all throughout the world for all receivers. Having a GPS receiver chip is making the GPS signal available. And over and above that, the Chinese and the Russian also launched their own global systems. The Chinese launched the Baidu, which, like Ashwin said, more than 40, in fact, 56 satellites is what they have in space right now. And the Russian GLONASS, they had launched in a similar year, and around the 1990s was when the Russians had also made their system operational, albeit with a bit of glitches in their system as compared to the GPS. But the typical GPS receiver, which we are coming to know today as a generic GPS receiver, what we so call it, is actually a multi-GNSS receiver, and it is able to receive signals from multiple constellations of satellites, be it the American GPS system, be it the Russian GLONASS system, or be it the Chinese Baidu system, and to a large extent, even the Indian NavIC system or the Japanese QZSS or the Galileo system, European system for that matter. And it is able to give us a solution for finding our position, for navigating to a certain place, and for timing purposes. So these receivers are very well capable of using it all throughout the world without any hitch. Now, having said that, addressing the original, the question that we are sort of alluding to, the geopolitical aspects of it, I feel that India as a country, as a nation, is not really looking at any expeditionary sort of a warfare. So I do not foresee any scenario in which the Indian military would require to, at least not in the short term, and hopefully not in the long term also, where the Indian state would require to do bombing in, say, Hawaii. So our requirements, even for the military, are pretty much restricted to our immediate neighborhood, wherein we are very content, or we were very content, in just defending the borders of our nation and exploiting GPS for its peaceful purposes, which is in any case, available to us. However, having said that, again, what Ashwin said is that the aspirations to have a global navigation system, which is also indigenous and which is also providing us accurate and precise positioning services like the American Navstar GPS system, is something which, it can be an aspirational thing which we definitely should aspire for, and we should aim for something like that in the long term.
Right. Just from understanding all these five other major navigation systems, these are also freely available, publicly available globally, right? Or are there any restrictions on them? For example, does China's Baidu have any restrictions? And also to understand, say, if during a geopolitical conflict, say in the current Iran war, there were some navigation services that were denied, say in the Hormuz area or something of that sort. Does that impact our ability to navigate those trades, or and for that purpose, do we require a larger navigation system?
So there's a bit of a nuance to this question, and let us again go back to the Kargil war. Now, we say that during the Kargil war, the GPS signal was denied to us. Despite that, if you would have heard in the in the popular media, there was this Tiger Hill bombing which we had carried out. So how were we able to target and destroy a very pinpoint with pinpoint accuracy a designated target? So what we did was we made use of various other facilities, something known as the listening pod on some of our fighter aircraft like the Mirage 2000. So they have a laser designation capability which enables them to do targeting with very precise accuracy. So this was the case even in 1999. So now the case is even stronger in the sense that there are various alternative technologies which enable us to prosecute warfare in a GPS denied environment. And this is as far as the military side of it is concerned. So this technologies like the lightning pod, technologies like the INS system, and these sort of technologies enable us to do target. Now we come to the civilian navigation. So like you mentioned, the Straits of Hormuz, or navigating our way through a place where the GPS signal has been denied. So yes, like we discussed, the receivers which are the modern receivers which are available, by design philosophy itself, all the constellations that we have, be it the American, the Chinese, the Russian, the Japanese, the Indian, by the design philosophy itself, they are meant to have openness in the usability of these signals. So they function on something known as the L1 band, the L5 band. There is also an L2, L3, L4 band, which is a little bit maybe off our topic of discussion. And then there is the S band. So all of these satellite systems, by the design philosophy itself, they want and they need that any receiver which is functioning as a civilian receiver, it should never be having any sort of denial, or it should never be blind, because having such a system or having such a blindsidedness will actually cause loss of life, and it will cause accidents which are very major in nature and which no nation wants to have. So this means that 24/7, 365 and 360-degree coverage of the globe, we do have the navigation signal available to a receiver which is having a typical multi-GNSS receiver. And having said that, if there is a place or a place of conflict where at a certain place and a certain time a conflict is being waged, we do have these jammers. And why are these jammers again so successful? It is because all of these systems are using the similar, the band swaths. These are the signals are in the range of 1100 megahertz to 2200, 2500 megahertz. That is the sort of frequency bands in which these signals operate. So, depending upon the sophistication and the sort of power of the jammer, there are jammers which exist for blocking a GPS signal, say in an area of 1 or 2 blocks of a city, to an entire area denial sort of a thing. And generally, the area denial is affected not by jammers as much as by using the satellite system itself to sort of disable them from transmitting the satellites in a certain position. Because as you said, that the constellation of satellites which are there, these satellites are constantly rotating around the Earth with a period of 12 hours. So you'll have various satellites which are coming overhead a certain point and on ground. And a certain any point on ground requires minimum four signals from four satellites for it to have a navigation solution. So what they do is they deny the navigation transmission of a navigation signal from one or multiple of these satellites which are overhead that point on the ground, and that is how that denial takes place.
Right.
And
Ashwin,
if
you
I
had
can
something to
add,
add? Yeah.
if I can add to the geopolitical angle, jamming is, like Hitesh said, a localized phenomenon, and it can get larger. But at the grand scheme of things, it is at a systemic level still a localized phenomenon. You cannot just jam an entire country or an entire continent. So the real risk of denial for a nation state comes from the owners of these constellations itself. So what if the Americans, what if the Chinese turn off their GPS or pedo signals over India? That is the risk. And this is where the balance of power logic becomes interesting. Because see, the actors that are in question are the US, Russia, European Union, and China. And right now, in the current geopolitical climate, each of their interests are different enough and they diverge enough that even in any plausible conflict scenario that you can imagine, at least two will likely remain open to India, irrespective of which side of the like conflict we land on. It will always be that at least the China and the Russian system will stay active and our multi-GNSS receivers will be able to work on them, or the American and the European will be active. And arguably, Russia can also be active at in some cases, in whatever plausible scenarios you can imagine. So that level of redundancy already exists, but for the civilian domain. And so the economy can continue to function and go on as per the norm because of this built-in redundancy between all of these countries and the way their interests diverge. So what really India needs its own standalone operations for, its own navigation system for, is considering this layer of redundancy, the four layer redundancy exists, but in the specific case of military operations, where we need to have the sense of security and trust that no matter who does what, we will have our own systems. And it will be military grade. It will not be a civilian, unencrypted, and easier to spoof signal, but rather a military grade encrypted signal that is available exclusively to our forces is the scenario that we are trying to target and fulfill using NavIC.
Right. Now let's move to the current issue that we had with NavIC satellite systems. So at the heart of the current crisis is, I guess, a small component called the rubidium atomic clock. And if I'm not wrong, even 1 nanosecond or 1 billionth of a second timing error translates to a location error of about 30 centimeters on the ground, right? So these clocks have to be extraordinarily precise, and therefore, I guess India sourced its clocks from a Swiss company. I guess the name of the company is Spectra Time, if I'm not wrong. But these same clocks had also failed on Europe's Galileo constellation, right? So, I mean, and that wasn't the secret. So, did we make an error in using them? And what does this tell about the global supply chain for critical space components? And to tie in with that, since we are the other issue that we also are looking at is, I guess, of the 11 NavIC satellites that have been launched since 2013, only 3 are currently providing navigation data. And I guess one failed to reach orbit, 5 lost their atomic clocks, something of that sort. And one is stranded in the wrong orbit. And the satellite that just failed had literally also completed its 10-year designed life. So this wasn't a surprise. So why did we not actually replace it in time? And is there something that we need to rethink in terms of our priorities when it comes to NavIC? So 2 questions here.
Yeah, so I can. It is interesting that you should frame, this current situation as, with the rubidium clocks as the heart of the issue. Let me put it to you in a different way, Arindam. I would say rather that the current issue of a NavIC satellite failure due to a rubidium clock malfunction or a rubidium clock failure, I would say that this is the face of the issue, and the heart of the issue is something else, which we'll talk about subsequently. So first, let us talk about the rubidium clocks and what is their importance in this navigation system as such. So the rubidium clocks are present in every navigation satellite, and in a way, they are the central sort of component on which the GPS navigation system is based. Or by GPS, I am referring now to the generic global navigation satellite system, GNSS system. Any GNSS system is based on that. And every satellite, which is a GNSS satellite, be it the Baidu, Galileo, GPS, or NavIC, they carry not just one or two, but they carry multiple atomic clocks precisely for this reason, that they are supposed to be very, very critical, and hence they require to have not just one layer of redundancy, but multiple layers of redundancy. So what is the clock and how does it work is, the clock measures time to a very, very precise order of magnitude. And it will be very interesting to note that this order of magnitude is something of the order of 10 raised to minus 16th of a second. So this is an order of magnitude. If we look at the distance in this with this length, then this is at the not just the nano, but the pico, atto, femto. That is the level of precision to which these clocks are measuring the time. And because of this highly accurate nature of their measurement of time, they also happen to be one of the most exotic and one of the most difficult of pieces of hardware to that humanity has managed to build. Now, a typical rubidium clock would maybe occupy a typical master rubidium clock would occupy maybe half a room in a laboratory on Earth, from where you have a master control station and it sets off the time. Whereas in the satellite, the entire problem now becomes twice manifold complicated. Firstly, we have to miniaturize it, and secondly, we have to space harden it. We have to protect this clock against vibrations, which is of the order of many Gs in a typical launch of a rocket or satellite. And we have to protect it against the harshness of heat and cold in space. We have to also insulate against the vacuum of space and such other problems and issues. Now, why this is very important is that the navigation satellite signals travel at the speed of light, which is 3 into 10 raised to 8 meters per second. And at that speed at which these signals are traveling, they are transmitted, they require approximately 67 milliseconds, approximately 70 milliseconds to reach a position on the Earth. And every 3 microsecond of a error, of a plus or minus error, will add 1 kilometer to your distance. So imagine, not 3 seconds, not 3 milliseconds, but 3 microseconds will give you an error of a kilometer. So this is how we can appreciate that why this accuracy is required. Now, having said that, all of these satellites contain either 3 or 4 atomic clocks. And all of these atomic clocks, out of all of these atomic clocks, there is only one atomic clock which is functioning as a live atomic clock, which is actually giving you the timing signal for the GPS to function. Now, out of these satellites, the atomic clocks, which as far as we talk about them, these are not something which are not prone to failure. For all the reasons that I have said, firstly, the life of atomic clocks is not very high. When they were initially launched in the 1980s and the 1970s and 80s, the life of atomic clocks was hardly 3 to 4 years, even for the American system. Thereafter, when the Russians and the Chinese launched their own satellites, I am not aware of publicly documented precise events where the clock has failed, but there have been satellite downtimes which have been referred to, even in the Galileo and even in the Chinese systems, wherein they have specifically mentioned that the atomic clock has failed. So now coming to the Indian context, the clock inside NavIC which has failed, I would put it not so much as having malfunctioned or having just stopped working, as much as having reached its design end point of life, which was roughly 10 years, as I am given to understand by the public announcements which have come up through ISRO. So it is not something which has sprung up on us as a surprise event or as something which we did not foresee. However, it is a systemic sort of a challenge that we knew has been festering in the system. And for some reason or the other, we were not able to address that issue. And thereafter, now that issue has come up onto us. And maybe Ashwin can jump in over here.
Yeah, it is that like you said, the clock failed literally 3 days after completing its 10-year design life, and these are very delicate instruments operating in a very harsh environment for years and years. And like Hitesh said, initially the GPS satellites were targeting a mission life of 2 years, but they had the launch infrastructure to keep replacing the clocks the satellites that they lost, and they could keep the service running. Well, that's another issue, but ultimately it's that these instruments are delicate. They have these rubidium vapors inside a glass lamp that have to burn continuously for years, but eventually some of this vapor leaks, and once that happens, the vapor is depleting inside the lamp, and you cannot replace it, or you cannot service it once it's already up in space, and so therefore you'll have to eventually replace it. And I guess that is the part of the problem. The main reason this gets highlighted so much is because we have not been able to replace the satellites as and when we need. We have run into a few unfortunate issues with launches sometimes. Another time the launch was successful, but the satellite could not be inserted into orbit itself. So all of that placed stress on the existing NavIC satellites that were already operational. And yeah, that was like a domino effect that has sort of staggered the system over time.
Yeah, I think just a bit more to add to what Ashwin has said. So I think Ashwin mentions what is the central point of this entire issue, which is we keep thinking about NavIC as psychologically we feel it is a sort of a exotic technology, whereas it is not. I feel NavIC is national infrastructure. And like any national infrastructure, even something like, if you build, to give an analogy, if India decides to build a bullet train from say from Ahmedabad to Delhi or say from Bangalore to Bombay, then it is not just a single train that we look at building, right? And it is not just a single track. We need to build the entire infrastructure and ecosystem in order to support that bullet train. So it is not just sufficient that we build one track, one bullet train, and we say, hey, we have a bullet train. We require to have additional redundancies to figure out that, hey, if the bullet train goes unserviceable, what is the for spare parts, where do we tap into? Or, hey, if the track becomes unusable, then what is the alternate track that we have? Or how about solidifying and, having a safety net around the track? So in a similar vein, the national infrastructure, which is NavIC, also needs depth. It needs industrial depth. It needs depth in launch capability. It needs depth in terms of operational capability. And finally, it needs depth in terms of replenishment. Now, we have been unable, despite having the problem available with us, we have for some reason not prioritized NavIC enough to have all of these industrial launch, operational replenishment depth, which has led to us arriving at this point where we have a situation where the NavIC satellite has now stopped working, or rather, I would say it is still not stopped working. The satellite is still functional. It is still able to transmit signals. And in fact, the satellites of NavIC, which are not transmitting a PNT, that is a navigation signal, are being used very imaginatively for something else. Do you know, Arindam, about the SMS services that we are having with this?
No. What's that exactly?
So the SMS services are basically NavIC. Also, the NavIC receivers, since they are able to receive signal messages from a NavIC satellite. So how the government has played it is that these receivers are able to receive short bursts of messages, which can convey important information to, say, a fisherman who is at his boat on the sea. It can have information such as, hey, there is a bad weather or a storm approaching from so and so direction. Please come back and return to the coast. Or hey, you are straying too far away from the boundary of our maritime boundaries for fishing, and please return back to somewhere nearer to the continental Indian maritime boundary. And similarly, all other NavIC receivers can receive messages from the NavIC satellites, even when they are not giving you a full navigation message for navigation purposes. So it is not that the satellites are totally useless. It is just that they are unable to function as what they were intended, which was to give us precise navigation services. And because somewhere or the other, we have not thought enough in hindsight, of course, I'm also saying this in hindsight, that as a nation, we have not given enough of a priority to supporting the NavIC constellation is the reason that we have arrived at this point where we have a certain glitch and we are unable to replenish or repair that glitch.
Right. Now, if you were to look at the way forward, there's I guess, the fact that India's second generation NVS satellites include an atomic clock that's been developed at ISRO's Space Application Center in Ahmedabad, I guess. So I guess that's a significant technological achievement. Also, there's a proposal, as you talked about redundancy, right? So there's the proposal for future satellites to carry, I guess, 5 atomic clocks each. So I guess developing this indigenous clock is one good thing. But what do you think about this trade-off, right? Do you prioritize speed and use imported components, or do you go for self-reliance at the cost of delay? And another question to this was, there's this another proposal floating around that India could launch pairs of NavIC satellites on foreign heavy lift rockets, Ariane 6 or SpaceX's Falcon 9, etc. Right? So, but again, that sort of creates an obvious irony, right? There's a foreign dependency that NavIC was built to eliminate, but now we are sort of maybe downplaying that, right? So, is that a pragmatic short-term fix, or are we undermining the strategic rationale of the program?
For this, I would like Ashwin to take the latter side of the argument, because as you know, as we were discussing before the podcast, Ashwin is the more optimistic from amongst the two of us. I am the more sort of, and I'm not so pessimistic, but more technical. I will say probably technically involved in this NavIC thing. So I'll just give you a bit of gloom and doom about the NavIC thing, what you were talking about, indigenization.
Mhm.
After which I will leave it to Ashwin to give us sort of the good news if there is any. So I was looking into the indigenization of the rubidium atomic clocks that we were talking about. And to my bit of disappointment and dismay, what I realized was that so-called indigenization that we are doing is actually, there's a tie-up with another agency. It's an Israeli firm called Acubate. And we are sort of, what we are doing is since the atomic clocks are very complicated pieces of hardware, so we are sort of obtaining those different pieces and we are sort of assembling them at home, which is also, it is no mean feat. It is not like assembling a Lego block, the entire assembly of an atomic clock. It's a huge step forward. But as I understand, the core development of an atomic clock, like Ashwin said, so the rubidium gas is firstly heated to a gaseous state at a temperature of 40 to 50 degrees. And what happens is inside the atomic clock, when the atoms are heated, they jump to a higher state. And when they jump to a higher state and they come down to the lower state, there are two emissions which happen. One is at a frequency which we want. The other is at the frequency which is to be discarded. So the frequency that we want is that, 12-digit number, which is a very large number of vibrations per second, that is taken into a sort of a cyclical loop and it is used to excite an oscillator which oscillates at its given period and gives us the beating time of every single second. So out of that many number of atoms, there is also by force, there is a certain number of atoms which we are forced to sort of discard from the system of the closed loop cycle of the system. And that is how you have the gas, which over a period of time, the gas sort of depletes. So now, as you can imagine, this is a very, very delicate and a finely balanced process. But To the best of my knowledge, I could not find, when I was speaking to people around who are knowledgeable about this and people who are in the industry, we have not been able to sort of make it fully indigenously on our own. And this is where I feel is one of our major drawbacks of the entire Atmanirbharta or the indigenous development programs, where I feel that we should not equate procuring parts from outside the country and thereafter building them to something which is a totally homegrown system, because that is something which will actually give us a quantum jump in our capabilities. Now, having said that, it is not entirely that bad at all, and that is where I'll probably let Ashwin have a say at it.
Yeah, completely agree with Hitesh, because this whole model of bringing in external components and assembling it in India has also caused other second order effects which have further complicated matters. For instance, the earlier NavIC satellites with the spectra time rubidium clocks were much more miniaturized. So we were launching them on the Polar Synchronous Launch Vehicle, which is the Polar Space Launch, the PSLV, which is the more, like it's the workhorse rocket of the Indian space program.
Yeah.
And that allowed us to have a higher launch cadence logistically. But now that the newer second generation of NavIC satellites are using indigenously made clocks, they have become much, much larger. So, in one effect, we have traded importing of finished products and trying to develop them indigenously. So we have traded the component level of the supply chain security for the launch layer of the sovereignty and security, because now we need heavier rockets, and because we cannot use the PSLV anymore, we are using the GSLV Mark II for all these launches, because that's a heavier, that's a rocket that can lift more. And because of that, there will be more delays. It shares its first stage with the PSLV, and now PSLV has been in a few failures recently, so that has then pushed timelines even more. And there is that whole cycle that complicates things. Like Hitesh said, the at the end of the day, this has to be seen as a national infrastructure, and the policy side of things does give us some hope. The idea now is that we should not be burdening ISRO for every single one of our operational and logistical space related tasks. And that is also one of the problems which has led to this system being the way it is, because ISRO was doing everything. You hear ISRO landing probes and rovers on the moon. On the other hand, you see them preparing for the Gaganyaan program, where we are taking Indian Gaganyatris to orbit. And parallelly, we are building launch vehicles, developing new ones, operating the different launch ports, and running the communication infrastructure, the GSAT satellites, the Earth observation satellites, provisioning those transponders to various vendors, and at the same time maintaining all the existing infrastructure, including NavIC. That's a lot for a single space agency. The focus gets divided. It comes at an opportunity cost. So now the new system is that ISRO will only do the cutting edge things, the things that are not commercially viable for any private sector party to do, but still is very, very important for the country, scientifically, politically, for our national goals, for what India will become as a space power in the coming years. And so when ISRO is handling all these high stakes, cutting edge, pushing the frontiers of research kind of projects, the rest of the operational things are slowly going to be transitioned to the industry. And so this is still nascent, this is still new. The policy itself is only 3 years old. The most of the companies that have come up, the startups, are all still nascent, and they are growing in capabilities. The government, the companies, everyone is still learning how to undergo this metamorphosis, this transition, and how to make it all work. But the future is going to be something like ISRO will only do something very complex, like manufacturing the rubidium clocks itself, while maintaining the infrastructure, the launching the replacements, doing the routine maintenance. All of this will be taken over by the commercial players. And it's not started to happen yet, but we are seeing all the ingredients that will eventually come out to form this system, and I think we are heading towards that future. There is already so many companies that operate on so many levels in the private sector, right? You have some Indian firms that make chipsets for NavIC that work with both NavIC and GPS, and that has also been supplied to the armed forces in India. So it is on some level military grade and proven. There are other integrators that are trying to bind the NavIC infrastructure with the ground-based technology so that the adoption can increase. There is also a startup which is still in very early stages, but trying to do what NavIC does, but from a much lower altitude constellation, from the lower Earth orbit. And that will be a great complement to NavIC if it proves viable, because NavIC is, like we mentioned in the earlier part of the episode, at a very, very high altitude at around 36,000 kilometers. So having a lower thought altitude constellation that can transmit more powerful signals that reach us with much more strength can be a good way to counter jamming and spoofing and all of that, and it can be a good complement to our whole navigation infrastructure. So we have these avenues to explore as we try and envision the future of NavIC, and I think we will see these solutions happen. Even we cannot be too impatient about this, because, like I said, we are still learning, and we are still learning to do this. We are still learning to introduce industry into our strategic domain infrastructure processes, and that will take some time. But this standardization, this multi-stakeholder operation network will, I think, come up in the coming years, and hopefully it doesn't take too long.
Great. That's a great positive note to end our podcast. Thanks, Ashwin and Hitesh, for this wonderfully detailed discussion on this topic, both technically as well as around the geopolitical aspects. I'm sure our listeners would take a lot out of this episode. So yeah, thanks Ashwin, thanks Hitesh.
Thanks, Ashwin. Thank you, Arindam, for hosting us.
Thank you. Good conversation.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.